A very warm and delighted greetings to the respected guest, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, Principal Ma'am, teachers, and fellow students present here. I, Shivadati Pandey, a student of third year Economics Honors, would like to thank you all for making your presence for this online seminar on economic perspective on G20 by Econtrix. Econtrix, the Economics Association of Shyama Prasad Mukherjee College for Women, has strived to help students reach their full potential by giving students the ideal forum for showcasing their creativity and intelligence. In the same way that our college, a wonderful institution, has always encouraged students to go beyond their own expectations, Econtrix aspires to assist students accomplish the same. The organization, Econtrix, has organized a number of events that have boosted students' self-esteem and allowed them to focus their attention on useful endeavors. I now request Iti ma'am to take this event further. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiva. Good morning to the distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Prabhat Patnaik sir, and my economic department. It is absolute pleasure to welcome you all to this significant event. I am Iti Tomar and I have the distinct honor of being your host for today. The gathering marks a momentous occasion where we come together to delve into discussions that are not only intellectually stimulating, but also deeply relevant to our academic community. Before we further proceed, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the esteemed individual in our midst. First and foremost, good morning, Principal Ma'am. We are privileged to have you here. Whose unwavering dedication and leadership have paved the way for academic excellence in our institution. We are also honored, she's not here by the way, but we are honored to have the support of Dr. Subhasina ma'am as an IQAC coordinator. Joining us is the head of department, Dr. Jyotsna ma'am, whose guidance and vision have played a pivotal role in shaping our department into a center of excellence. In addition, we extend our warm welcome to all the faculty members who are the backbone of our academic community, our diligent students who represent the future of our institution, and each participant who has taken the time to be part of this event. Thank you for being here. Without further ado, let's commence our program. Now, I would like to call our respected principal ma'am, Professor Sadhna Sharma ma'am, to say a few words. Ma'am.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to all of you.
Thank you, ma'am, for gracing us with your words of wisdom.
Because of G20, as India has participated and organized the presidency for G20. So, and I welcome Professor Patnaik, who is the master of economics actually, and you will know his views on economic perception or perspective after organizing this event of G20. Now it is not G20, actually it is G21 now, because Africa has been inducted in this now. And I welcome Professor Patnaik, and as he is here, I should not take much time. I welcome him again and again, and I congratulate the economics department and welcome all the participants who will learn so many things after this program. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to welcome you and congratulate you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your inspirational words. We are extremely happy to welcome our esteemed guest, Dr. Prabhat Patnaik sir, who is a renowned economist and a distinguished professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. Sir's academic journey is marked by a commitment to rigorous scholarship and unwavering dedication to principles of equity and justice, and a key understanding of the economic and social challenges facing our world today. He has spent several decades at the forefront of economic research, and his work continues to influence policy and shape academic discourse in India and beyond. His publications have not only been instrumental in deepening our understanding of these subjects, but but have also provided invaluable insights into the pressing issues of poverty, inequality, and development in the global south. Today, we are privileged to have Dr. Prabhat Patnaik, sir, as our keynote speaker, and we eagerly await the profound insight and wisdom he will share with us during this webinar. Now, without further ado, I would like to hand over the session to Sir for his enlightening insights and keynote address. Sir, the virtual floor is yours.
First of all, thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you very much for the invitation to me to address this gathering. I'm very grateful that you have asked me to give this lecture. The topic I've chosen is growth and poverty in the Indian economy, in order to highlight certain aspects of our economic experience, which normally are not much covered. Now, the fact that there has been a significant acceleration in economic growth in the country since the adoption of neoliberal policies in 1991 is something which one broadly has to accept, because this is based on official data. It is true that the most pronounced increase in GDP has been in the service sector. And of course, the service sector is always a very tricky sector, not just conceptually, but also statistically. Conceptually, it is tricky because it's very difficult to distinguish between transfers across people on the one hand and service sector activity on the other. I'll give you an example. If a beggar comes to me and I give, let us say, 5 rupees to the beggar, in that case, that strictly speaking is a transfer. But on the other hand, it can be argued that giving the 5 rupees to the beggar gives me a certain amount of satisfaction, in which case the beggar is providing me with a service for which I'm paying him 5 rupees. So it's always very difficult to distinguish between transfers and payment for services. As you know, starting from Adam Smith, there has been a tradition that does not include the service sector in the sphere of economic activity. In the old socialist countries, Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and so on, the service sector activity was never included in GDP. GDP was defined entirely in terms of the material production sector. And Adam Smith, as you know, had actually drawn a distinction between the material production sector and service sector activities on the grounds that the laborers engaged in the service sector activity constituted what he called unproductive labor. His distinction between productive and unproductive labor was on the grounds of whether a person is engaged in producing what he called a vendible commodity, or whether the person is engaged in producing a service which, as he said, perishes the moment it is produced. So the service sector, and there are statistical problems, of course, naturally, in estimating service sector GDP. Therefore, even though our acceleration in GDP has been mainly in the service sector, and therefore it is not as satisfactory as would have been the case had it been in the material commodity producing sectors, nonetheless, there has been an acceleration, and that acceleration is a very important feature of contemporary Indian economy. That means starting from 1991, if you compare the previous period, in fact, entirely since independence, in that case, there has been, in the period from 1991, a certain acceleration in GDP growth, in fact, a quite noticeable acceleration in GDP growth. On the other side, what you do find is that income inequalities have increased dramatically. As a matter of fact, Thomas Piketty, as you know, the French economist who wrote this book, Capital in the 21st Century, Thomas Piketty has got this world income data set, and Piketty and another French economist called Jean actually made estimates of income inequality in India for various periods. The measure of inequality which they adopt is the share of the top 1% of the population in the total national income. 1% or 10% or so on, but I would be taking their top 1% share estimates. So the share of the top 1% in total national income. And they use income tax data. Income tax, as you know, was introduced in India in 1922. And since then, we have had income tax data, and the latest year for which they make the estimates is 2013-14 and 14-15. Now, what they find is that the income inequality, as measured by the share of the top 1% in the total national income, in 2013-14 and 14-15 was higher than at any time since 1922, than at any time since income tax was introduced. As a matter of fact, they find that after independence, there was actually a decline in the share of the top 1%, and that decline continued till about 1982, when the share of the top 1% had come down to just 6% of national income. Since then, it started rising precisely over the neoliberal period, and in 2013-14 and 14-15, it had reached about 22% of the national income, which is quite remarkably high. Now, the fact that this level was higher than at any period since 1922 is quite significant, because in the old days, we had Maharajas and so on. There was enormous amount of social and income inequality. But even so, they find that actually the income inequality in 2013-14 and 14-15 was actually higher than even in the pre-independency period. In fact, on any date since income tax was introduced in 1922. Not only has income inequality increased, but you actually also find that nutritional poverty has increased in the country. Now, this is a remarkable phenomenon. This, of course, is something which is borne out by all this World Hunger Index. You must have seen recently in the papers, the World Hunger Index is calculated for those countries where hunger is prominent. Is calculated for about 125 countries. Not all countries of the world. It's not calculated for the United States or Europe and so on. It's calculated mainly for the global South, where hunger is predominant. And then you find that in that, India's rank was 111th this year. It was 110 last year, and so on. It has been hovering around 100. Now, for a country which is generally considered to be a newly emerging economy or an emerging market economy, to have such high levels of hunger is something which is really quite remarkable. It's quite intriguing and it's quite astonishing in some sense. What you find, moreover, is that this level of hunger has actually increased after the neoliberal reforms were introduced. I'll give you two sets of statistics to corroborate this. The first is the fact that actually the Planning Commission in India had defined a nutritional norm which was 2,200 calories per person per day in rural India and 2,100 calories per person per day in urban India as the benchmark. Below these figures, if a person consumed less calories, that person was considered poor. while above these figures, it was considered rich, not poor. So that, as a matter of fact, the poverty line, as originally conceived, was a poverty line that really corresponded in expenditure terms to the point at which these norms were satisfied. As a matter of fact, initial poverty estimates were done by looking at NSS data, National Sample Survey data, to find out at what level of monthly per capita expenditure do people actually just meet these particular estimates or these particular benchmark figures for calorie intake. And of course, that was taken as the poverty line. Since then, there has been a lot of, and then that was brought up taking a cost of living index. And since then, there has been a lot of kind of, interference with the definition of poverty line and so on. But let's go back. Let's go back to the original benchmark estimate that the Planning Commission had put forward for poverty, and which nobody has questioned till now. It's not as if we have abandoned it. We have simply changed our definition of poverty, but nobody has questioned and nobody has said that we have changed the definition because that is no good as a measure. If you take the proportion, and I shall use only NSS, as you know, the National Sample Survey has an annual survey of a very small sample, and every 5 years it has a large sample survey. NSS large sample surveys are actually of significance because it's the biggest sample survey anywhere in the world. It's set up by Professor Mahalanobis and something to be proud of. India had a statistical base for estimating things which no other country really had. No other country in the global south, and of course in the global north, not on such a scale anyway. So if you take quinquennial survey years, in 1993-94, which is the first quinquennial survey, after the introduction of neoliberal reforms, the percentage of rural population that fell below 2,200 calories per person per day was 58%. For 2011-12, which is the latest year for which we have data that are revealed, that proportion had increased to 68%. For urban India, the corresponding percentages below 2,100 calories per person per day were 57% in 1993-94 and 65% in 2011-12. Now, this is a remarkable increase in terms of poverty and nutritional deprivation. After that, 2017-18 was a year when, again, we had a quinquennial survey, but the data for 2017-18 were not revealed by the government because those data really showed a very poor picture. As a matter of fact, from what was leaked to the press, it appears that per capita, not just poverty and so on, just per capita real rural expenditure had fallen between 2011-12 and 17-18 by 9%. Now, obviously, since this fall would have been much greater for the poorer segments than for the richer segments in rural India, it would follow that actually the picture of poverty must have worsened by 2017-18. And this is something which also gets confirmed by macro level data. If you look at the per capita annual availability of food grains, at the beginning of the 20th century, that means around 1900 and so on, according to the estimates of Blinn, which many of you would be familiar with, was roughly around 200 kilograms in what was then called British India. This actually declined quite dramatically to, at the time of independence, I mean, let's say 46, 47, it declined to 138.5, a remarkable decline. But if you say that, okay, that was a disturbed year, let us take 5-year averages and so on, even then the decline in the terminal period, just on the eve of independence, was to less than 150 kilograms per person annual per capita availability. So there was a dramatic decline. Then after independence, with great difficulty, you remember Grow More Food program and so on and so forth were introduced. And then during the plans, there was an emphasis on ensuring that food grain production was jacked up and so on. Per capita availability, annual per capita availability increased till the end of the 1980s to about 180 kilograms per capita, as I said. Now, which was less than in British India at the time of the beginning of the 20th century, but nonetheless, a change, a reversal of the declining trend which you had observed in the last 50 years of colonial rule. In the period in which you have had the neoliberal reforms, per capita food grain availability first virtually stagnated, first fell slightly, then increased. If you take simply from the beginning to the end of the period, it has more or less stagnated at 180 kilograms. And of course, if it stagnates, then generally the condition of the relatively poorer segments of the population likely to get worse, because the well-to-do have access to food grains. I should make it very clear here that when I talk about food grain availability, I mean not just direct consumption of food grains, I mean direct and indirect. Indirect being through processed foods and also through feed grains for animals and then the use of animal products. So the better off segments, it's not as if they directly consume more wheat and rice, but they actually consume more animal products, and into the animal products, food grains enter as feed grains. So if you look at the direct and indirect intake of food grains, then you find that as far as the poorer segments are concerned, since the overall intake has been more or less constant per capita, as far as the poorer segments are concerned, this is likely to have actually declined. In other words, it confirms the finding earlier that the percentage of the rural and urban population below the benchmark levels of calorie intake have actually increased. And this is something which is also confirmed by the National Family Health Survey, which showed that the level of anemia among women has actually increased quite significantly in the recent years. So we have this remarkably contradictory picture. On the one hand, we have an economy which actually has increased its growth rate quite significantly. On the other hand, we have this economy in which not only have income inequalities increased, but as a matter of fact, poverty certainly defined nutritionally. Nutritional poverty has certainly increased, and there can be no two opinions about it. I mean, there can be no doubt about it. How do we explain this contradictory phenomenon? And I think it will be completely wrong to dismiss either of these phenomena. In other words, I mentioned that notwithstanding the fact that much of the growth has occurred in the service sector, we have to accept that there has been an acceleration in growth. Likewise, notwithstanding the fact that there has been an acceleration in growth, the fact that there has been an increased level of nutritional deprivation is something which, again, we have to accept. Now, if we do so, how can we, how can we explain this contradictory phenomenon? I believe that this contradictory phenomenon arises because of the very nature of a neoliberal economy. What happens in a neoliberal economy? You see, one thing which had happened in the previous period is that the government had supported what I would call petty production, that means peasant agriculture, craftsmen, fishermen, all the small production sectors had been supported by the government in very many different ways, which is not to say that they were flourishing or that they were prospering, but that their decline had been arrested. For instance, in peasant agriculture, we know that there was tariff protection and quantitative restrictions which had been imposed on imports and exports, quantitative trade restrictions, to make sure that actually the impact of world price fluctuations, and as you know, the world price fluctuations are quite sharp for agricultural commodities, the impact of world price fluctuations does not get felt on the Indian economy. There is a background to it. You see, the Indian anti-colonial struggle had taken off in a big way in the 1930s. And one of the reasons it had taken off is because the peasantry had joined it in large numbers. And the peasantry had joined it in large numbers because the peasantry was suffering acutely from the impact of the Great Depression. You know, the peasant debt went up. In Punjab, you had a debt relief committee set up by Sir Chotu Ram, who was then the minister and well known. Similarly, in Bengal, the Fazlul Haq ministry set up a debt relief committee. Peasants all over the country were getting indebted, and therefore they were in acute stress because the terms of trade moved sharply against peasant agriculture. One of the reasons and that's why the peasants joined in large numbers the anti-colonial struggle. And one of the promises of the anti-colonial struggle was that when India becomes independent, you would not be subject to the kind of distress you're witnessing today. And for this reason, actually, to redeem, as it were, the promise of the anti-colonial struggle, the moment India did become independent, you actually had the setting up of all these mechanisms in order to support the farmers in their in terms of prices. So price support, absence of fluctuations, subsidized inputs, and research and development being carried out in public laboratories, in public scientific research establishments, and being disseminated among the peasantry through one of the largest extension service systems anywhere in the world. And the Green Revolution was made possible because of that, because of the new seeds being developed on the one hand in government research institutions, and on the other hand, popularized through this enormous extension network that the government of India had actually set up. So I said subsidized inputs and above all subsidized credit. Bank nationalization, one of the purposes of bank nationalization was to make sure that institutional credit was made available to the peasants at subsidized rates. In fact, I remember when I was an undergraduate student of economics in Delhi University, we actually used to write tutorials why institutional credit would never reach agriculture. And our answer was that, there are so many different small kind of, borrowers that the transaction costs would be very high as far as the firms are concerned. And that's why it is better that the matter be handled by the moneylenders, since the banks would not find it really possible to do this. But on the other hand, actually, after bank nationalization, credit was reached to millions of peasants. And there is no doubt, Reserve Bank's figures themselves say that the proportion of credit, not only did we have priority sector lending norms, namely that actually 20% had to go to priority sector agriculture and so on. But what is more, when you look at the total credit accruing to the agricultural sector, the proportion of institutional credit in total credit actually went up significantly since the days of bank nationalization, right up to the 1980s. After that, it has fallen. So subsidized credit, subsidized inputs, assured prices, protection from fluctuations internationally, new varieties, new practices being made available to the peasantry through the extension network. All these really meant that there was a certain reversal of the decline in food grain output per capita and food grain availability per capita that had occurred in the last 50 years of colonial rule. Now, a lot of these have been done away with under neoliberalism. For food grains, we still have a procurement come price support operation. The three farm laws were trying to do away with it, but on the other hand, as you know, the three farm laws were withdrawn. But as far as cash crops are concerned, in the case of cash crops, the whole question of price support has really been done away with. Earlier, we had tea board, rubber board, coffee board, coir board, all these boards whose entire job was to actually make sure that in years of bad prices for the farmers, they would step in and buy. This was their marketing function. The boards continue, but their marketing function has been done away with. And this is something which is responsible for the fact that now, and similarly, now tariff protection is very extremely low. Quantitative trade restrictions have been done away with, generally done away with, and therefore you find that the peasants are now exposed to world market price fluctuations, so that, immediately at this very moment, the rubber growers in Kerala are facing an acute crisis. And this is one reason why there have been so many peasant suicides, because obviously cash crop growing requires credit. They borrow from banks or whatever in order to grow cash crops. But on the other hand, if the price collapse of the cash crop, they can't pay back. And when they can't pay back, then they commit suicide. So the fact that in the country there have been more than 3 to 4 lakh suicides in the last 30 years is something which is to do with the withdrawal of government support from peasant agriculture. And this is something which also is a withdrawal from the petty production sector generally. One impact of it, of course, it has a direct impact in lowering the incomes of these vast numbers of people, and that pushes them towards poverty. And secondly, it also means that many of them actually leave their traditional occupations and move to cities in search of work. You actually find that between 1991 census and 2011 census, which is the latest year for which we have had a census, the number of the census defines the agricultural population into two categories. One is cultivators, the other is laborers. You find that the number of cultivators between these two censuses has declined by 11 million. Now, some of them have become laborers, but others would certainly have migrated to the towns in search of work. So the squeeze on the petty production sector, including peasant agriculture, is one factor, one feature of neoliberalism which I'd like you to note. The second is that when these peasants, displaced peasants, go to towns, the generation of employment has slowed down. You see the rate of growth of employment as a pure algebraic truism is simply the rate of growth of output minus the rate of growth of labor productivity. Now, if the economy is now opened up to trade and therefore to competition from other countries, if we don't introduce, if our producers, that means producers in the modern sector, don't introduce technological progress, in that case, they would be outcompeted by other countries. Therefore, there is a race to introduce technological progress. There's a race to increase labor productivity. And if there's a race to increase labor productivity, you find that the labor productivity does actually increase. It increases both because of changes in the product mix that is produced, and it increases because of the changes in technology for producing the particular products that are actually produced. For instance, just take an example. I mean, we used to have all kinds of small markets. Now, nowadays we have malls. No, I'm not saying the markets have disappeared, but obviously to a very significant extent, malls have replaced markets. But on the other hand, the employment generating capacity of a mall is much less than the employment generating capacity of the traditional heart and so on that we had in India earlier. So all these technological structural changes have the effect of restricting employment generation. Now, this is something which many people don't realize. You often come across leaders saying that, our labor productivity growth has been very impressive. Yes, of course, it has been impressive. But on the other hand, that has as the counterpart the fact that our employment growth has been less than impressive. Some people calculate that actually in a period before we embarked on neoliberal reforms, our average rate of GDP growth annually was about 3.5% to 4%, let's say 4%. But on the other hand, the rate of growth of employment was about 2% per annum. Since then, while our rate of GDP growth has very roughly speaking doubled to about 8%, 7 to 8%, our rate of growth of employment growth has halved to just about 1% per annum. Now, this doesn't, of course, mean that we have more unemployed persons, but what it means is that a given amount of work is now distributed among a larger number of people, and therefore, it doesn't necessarily get captured in unemployment statistics that exist in the country, but it is something which is apparent from the casualization, informalization, and so on that has taken place on a very large scale in the Indian economy. I mean, now even modern enterprises are increasingly casualizing their workforce. Casualization of the workforce means that I present myself for employment today at the factory gate. The factory may say, sorry, we have no job for you today. Tomorrow I go, they may give me a job. In which case, our employment figures, which say, let us say, have you got any job in the last 1 week? Weekly status, would say, yes, I have been employed. But on the other hand, I now find that on several days when I was looking for a job, I didn't get a job. So in that sense, unemployment has certainly increased compared to the earlier period, which is quite remarkable. Despite the increase in GDP growth, unemployment has increased because of the fact that now the producers are under a compulsion to introduce technological structural change. An additional factor works in this direction, that if you have technological structural change that is actually employment economizing, that employment doesn't grow as much, in that case, our labor reserves don't get used up. Many of you would have done Arthur Lewis's argument about unlimited supplies of labor, that in countries like India, where you have very large labor reserves, much of the global south, China, Vietnam, and so on, where you have very large labor reserves generated by the impact of colonialism. Under colonialism, we had deindustrialization of the Indian economy, lots of craftsmen and so on were displaced, and then they crowded the labor market. So we have the emergence of substantial labor reserves, and these labor reserves, as Lewis argued, are responsible for keeping the real wages at a more or less subsistence level in all these economies. Now, an essential condition for development and for overcoming poverty must be the using up of these labor reserves. But on the other hand, if you find that employment grows only at about 1% per annum, that is roughly, that's even less than the rate of growth of the population, and therefore the rate of the growth of the workforce, and therefore your labor reserves would never get used up, let alone absorb the displaced peasants who are really crowding the urban labor market. Now, it follows, therefore, that I was talking about the additional factor. When this happens, then the real wages don't rise. If labor reserves is not getting diminished, real wages don't rise. When real wages don't rise, but labor productivity is increasing, that means the share of surplus in total output increases, income inequality increases. When income inequality increases, then you find that the better off segments of the population have a desire for goods. I mean, their demand for goods is for less employment intensive goods. I mean, they are the ones who would like a mall. They are the ones who, I mean, if you give a rupee to a person who is a peasant, let us say in Andhra Pradesh, and that rupee would be spent on some local goods which are available or produced locally, and therefore that would have an employment generating effect that would be quite significant. You give the same rupee to somebody in Delhi, let us say some well-to-do person in Delhi, then that person would in fact partly use the rupee, partly save a proportion of the rupee, such proportion as is consumed that the person may wish to go for a holiday in Greece or somewhere. Therefore, the employment effects leak out, or secondly, might actually go to a mall or might actually purchase an automobile, which has significant outside components coming in, more import intensive and so on. So the employment generating effect of the rupee would be much less if it is given to, let us say, a New Delhi elite compared to what it would be if it is given to an Andhra peasant or an agricultural laborer in Telangana. So the rise in income inequality also tends to have an employment diminishing effect on the economy. For all these reasons, you find that the labor reserves do not decrease. The labor reserves, if anything, have increased during the neoliberal period. At the same time, you have a worsening in the condition of the petty producers, of peasant agriculturists, and so on. It is these two factors that actually imply that the purchasing power in the hands of the bulk of the working population really does not increase even as labor productivity increases. In other words, per capita, the real purchasing power they have does not increase, while per capita, the output they produce increases quite significantly, which is, after all, why employment has not increased. Now, when this happens, that basically means the share of surplus, which means output minus wages, or if you like, if we are looking at it in per capita terms, labor productivity minus the real wage divided by labor productivity. That would be the share of surplus in total output. This share of surplus in total output increases, not just in India, but it has been increased in most countries. In fact, the increase in income inequality is really quite striking. It is so striking that even people like the Davos summit and so on are talking about it. they explain, their explanation for it may not agree with what I'm saying, but on the other hand, the fact of the increase in income inequality under neoliberalism is something which is indubitable. As a matter of fact, Piketty and others have really got figures to establish this point. When this happens, as I mentioned, the propensity to consume out of a unit of income of the surplus earners is much less than of the working people, than of the laborers, cultivators, workers, and so on. And therefore, every such income distribution shift implies that there is a restriction of demand. And if this income distribution shift keeps happening, that basically implies that we move towards a crisis of overproduction, a sort of Keynesian crisis where aggregate demand tends to keep lagging behind the output. And this is something which has been happening in the world economy for quite some time. And of course, particularly in the period after the collapse of the housing bubble in America in 2008. This is now so common that even well-known establishment economists in the US and so on are now talking about a secular stagnation in the world economy. So neoliberalism not only generated a dramatic increase in income inequality and, of course, even in nutritional poverty, despite stepping up the growth rate of economies like India in the heyday, in the period when it was doing very well. But what is more, this neoliberalism has now run into a crisis that all over the world is well known. People are talking about a crisis of neoliberalism. And there is no obvious solution to the crisis of neoliberalism within neoliberalism itself. Why not? Keynes had told us that, look, if you have a problem of deficiency of aggregate demand, that problem can be very easily resolved. What you do is that the state then comes and spends and makes up for any deficiency of aggregate demand. If the state spends, in that case, whatever shortfall from full employment output there was because of the fact that demand was not adequate can be made good by the state actually creating that much of extra demand. But the state's expenditure can create that demand only under two conditions. If that expenditure is financed by a fiscal deficit, or alternatively, if that expenditure is financed by a tax on the rich, by a tax on capitalists and so on. Why? Because if you impose a tax on the working people, they more or less consume their entire income. Their saving propensity is very low. So if you take a rupee, if the state takes a rupee in the form of taxes from the working people and spends it, in that case, there's very little net expansion in demand because the consumption of the working people would shrink by almost a rupee, even as the state expenditure increases by a rupee. But on the other hand, if you take a rupee from the rich, from the capitalists, in that case, that rupee being spent by the government would actually generate a net expansion in demand because the capitalists would be out of that rupee. Only, let us say, 50 paise would mean a reduction in their consumption. The other 50 paise would be a reduction in their savings. But on the other hand, the government's expenditure would generate entirely a rupee's worth of extra demand, so that there's a net expansion of demand of 50 paise. Looking at it differently, you're all students of economics, that the balanced budget multiplier is actually positive if the taxation is levied on the higher income groups, while the balanced budget multiplier is close to zero if the taxation is levied on the poorer segment, the richer, the working people of the country. But if you do this, if you either finance government expenditure through a fiscal deficit, you see, fiscal deficit basically means you're not taxing anybody, in which case there is no reduction in anybody's demand, while the government is simply printing notes or borrowing from banks in order to increase its demand. So there's net expansion in demand. So if you have this, then of course, there would be a net expansion in demand. But both a rise in the fiscal deficit and greater taxation of the well-to-do are really measures which are opposed by globalized capital, particularly globalized finance. You see, we are in a very peculiar situation where globalized finance, that means finance is international. It is here in India today at one telephone call, it might move to Norway tomorrow. But on the other hand, while finance is international, the state remains a nation state. There's an Indian state, there's a Pakistani state, there is a Polish state, there's a Hungarian state, and so on. Therefore, the state, per force, has to do things to please finance, otherwise there would be an outflow of finance. And therefore, since finance does not like either a fiscal deficit or it does not like taxing the rich, because the financiers themselves are very rich. If in either case, therefore, the government is hamstrung, the government is not in a position to enlarge its expenditure in these ways, by financing in these ways, and therefore it's helpless in overcoming the deficiency of aggregate demand that Keynes had suggested. So, on the one hand, you have a tendency towards a crisis globally, not just in India. It is, of course, making itself felt in India. On the other hand, what you have is the inability of any state, because the states are nation states, to take the initiative in actually doing any Keynesian measures for overcoming that particular crisis. Therefore, within the world of neoliberalism, it seems that we are stuck in a period of what economists call secular stagnation. The secular stagnation is going to be with us for a very long time. Because of the secular stagnation all over the world, there is a tendency towards the emergence of neo-fascism. In many countries, you actually have governments coming to power which actually blame some segment of the population, typically immigrants and so on, in order to, as an explanation of the distress of the working people. As a matter of fact, the real explanation of the distress is the crisis of neoliberalism. But on the other hand, that crisis, since it cannot be overcome by big capital, cannot be overcome by the state, big capital feels threatened because of the perpetual existence of the crisis, and therefore tends to support groups which then talk about the fact that the migrants are stealing your jobs, the Mexicans are stealing your jobs, and so on. It can take different forms in different countries. It has taken some form in Poland, I said some form in Hungary, Turkey, and so on, Italy. Even in India, they're very strong neo-fascist emergence. So that is the way that is being sought to be dealt as far as the working people are concerned. That's no solution. You're not overcoming the crisis. Any neo-fascist government would face exactly the same problems because of the fact that there's globalized finance facing the nation state. They too would not be able to overcome the crisis. Unlike in the 1930s, when Hitler and Mussolini and the Japanese fascists had overcome the Great Depression through military expenditure financed by borrowing, financed by fiscal deficit. So we are now stuck in this position. If we are stuck in this position, then it seems to me that there is no alternative but to the fact that the nation... Sorry? Sorry? Okay. There is no alternative but to the fact that if we remain inside, we remain trapped in a crisis within neoliberalism, that we have to really opt out of neoliberalism, which means that we have to activate the state by ensuring that the economy is not subject to sudden financial outflows, by imposing capital controls. If we impose capital control, then if we impose capital control so that finance cannot flow out, then finance is not going to flow in either. So if it cannot flow in that case, we can't meet our current account deficit on the balance of payments. So we'll have to have trade controls as well. So we would have to move back into an economy which in some ways resembles what we had in the pre-neoliberal days. But I would like to suggest, and this is the last point I'm going to make, I'd like to suggest that, there is one way in which we have to, shall we say, adopt a new path. Now, this is something which many people are talking about. I mean, when Arvind Subramaniam was the chief economic advisor, the Economic Survey had talked about it. They're talking about a new path. What the new path is going to be, on that there are differences of opinion. And I have an opinion which I would like to present to you. The standard opinion that you often come across is the guaranteeing of a basic minimum income. This is what Arvind Subramaniam, the Economic Survey, had suggested, and many economists, Pranab Bardhan and others, are really talking about it. That ensure that everybody has a guaranteed minimum income. In order to finance that, you of course have to then raise taxes. When you raise taxes, if finance flows out, in that case, put capital controls. If you put capital controls, then trade controls may become necessary, and so on. Whatever you have to do, but make sure that there is a basic minimum income which is given, which everybody in the economy is assured of. Now, to me, this basic minimum income is not really satisfactory for a variety of reasons. The first thing is that the basic minimum income actually implies that the government is being generous, that, it actually makes the people who are recipients of government subsidies, as it were, mendicants. It's as if they are beggars to whom the government is providing some alms, which I think is offensive to the dignity of the recipient. The recipient must get something as a citizen of India as a matter of right, and that is something that the basic minimum income does not do. Secondly, the basic minimum income is something which can be withdrawn. This year you're providing a basic minimum income. Next year your fiscal situation is a bit tight, and therefore you say that no, sorry, we're going to cut down the basic minimum income and so on, or we're going to withdraw the scheme. Whatever it is subject to the availability of fiscal things. It's not, in other words, it is uncertain. There's a third reason also why I'm opposed to a basic minimum income scheme, and that is the fact that, there's no point giving money to people. Why do people need money? They need money in order to have better health care. They need money in order to have better nutrition. They need money in order to have better education and so on. But if you don't build schools, if you don't build hospitals, if all these facilities are not available, then simply giving money does not help. And what is more, it is true that if they spend money in that, and these facilities are not available through government provision, then they'll go to very expensive hospitals and expensive schools, and the money would not really mean very much. So it is important to ensure that there are provision by the government of basic commodities and basic services instead of simply giving them money, or in addition to giving them money, you have to do all this. Now, if you're going to do all this in addition to giving them money, then I would say that the best way of carrying out such an agenda would be to institute a set of fundamental economic rights that every citizen of India enjoys in addition to the political rights that we have, the right to freedom of expression, right to freedom of religion, and so on and so forth. So similarly, we ought to have a set of fundamental economic rights. Currently, the Indian Constitution actually has given a set of fundamental political rights, but all the economic vision for people's improvement is put into the directive principles of state policy, which are not justiciable. I mean, I can't take the government to court because it is violating the directive principles of state policy. So I would suggest the institution of a set of fundamental economic rights. Among these, I have calculated for 5 such rights. One is the right to food, which basically means that the current provisions which apply to the BPL population should really be made applicable to everybody. I may drop out of it. That's different, but I would have that right. Just as I may drop out of the right to freedom of expression by keeping my mouth shut, but on the other hand, that still gives me the right to freedom of expression. Now, the right to food is something which therefore should be generalized as a right, as a universal, justiciable, fundamental right, so that the citizen can take the government to court if that citizen is deprived of right, in this case is deprived of food. The second would be a right to employment. A right to employment, and failing the provision of employment, the provision of a wage which is statutorily fixed. We can have two different levels, one for skilled workers, the other for unskilled workers, and so on. But the right to wage. The basic presumption behind giving a wage, if you can't give a job, is that if I remain unemployed, in that case, it's not my fault, it's the fault of the social arrangement of which I am a part that cannot give me a job. So it is the responsibility of society to ensure that everybody gets a job. But if by chance society cannot ensure that, then it must at least be willing to provide a wage to everybody. The third right, which I would like to mention, is the right to free quality healthcare through a national health service of the kind that you have in Scandinavian countries, earlier in the Soviet Union, in Britain, and so on, through a national health service, not health insurance, but actually through a national health service, free quality healthcare. The fourth would be free quality education provided by public institutions. My calculations are only up to the higher secondary level. I'm not talking beyond that, but because I've made no calculations about that, but certainly at least up to higher secondary level, free quality, publicly provided education. The last one is a right to an adequate living old age pension and disability benefits. You'd be surprised to learn that the old non-contributory old age pension, again, people can opt out of it. If I'm a professor in JNU, if I get a pension, then I don't go to the government for this old age pension. But on the other hand, non-contributory universal old age pension is something which we should institute. You'd be surprised to know that at the moment, the old age pension that is given to a person is 200 rupees a month, which is a joke. I believe this should be, that it should be made 3,000 rupees a month as a minimum. I calculated on the basis of that. Now I think with inflation, it probably has to be further raised, but 3,000 rupees a month, and non-contributory, universal, as a right to every citizen. So, and corresponding disability benefits. So if you take these 5 rights, you may be wondering, but look, I mean, where do we get money for all these rights? I made a calculation, I'll end with that. You see that if you have to ensure these rights, in that case, in addition to what you spend on these heads, you have some old age pension scheme, you obviously spend on health, you obviously spend on education, you spend on food subsidy and so on. In addition to everything you spend on these schemes, you would require 10% of the GDP in addition, in order to institute these rights. Now, in order to spend 10%, you don't actually need to raise 10%, because as you spend, some of this expenditure accrues back to you as taxes. Okay, so in order to spend 10%, crude calculation would say that you need to raise 7% additional tax revenue. This 7% additional tax revenue can be raised in the country by simply 2 taxes levied on the top 1% of the population, levied only on the top 1% of the population. One is a 2% wealth tax, okay? On the wealth of the top 1% of the population, you just levy a 2% wealth tax. And the second is that the moment you impose a wealth tax, people are going to distribute their wealth among children and so on. So the second would be an inheritance tax, 1/3 inheritance tax, that if I'm going to pass down, let us say 100 crores, which is my property, among my 10 children, in that case, out of that 100 crores, 33.3 crores should be taken by the government. Now, this is something which you have in most capitalist countries. As a matter of fact, in most capitalist countries, the magnitude of the inheritance tax is even larger than 33 1/3% that I'm suggesting. In Japan, for instance, about 40%. Why is that? Because there is the philosophy of capitalism suggests that, look, of capitalism, I'm not talking about the socialist critique of capitalism. The capitalists themselves would say, Schumpeter said that, look, that the capitalists earn an income because they have some talents. Okay, the capitalist income is not a surplus extracted from the workers, but because they have some talent. What this talent is, different authors have different views about it. I won't go into. Schumpeter thought it was innovativeness. But the point, but if they have this talent, then their children, in order to become capitalists, must also display that talent. The moment you have inheritance, you actually introduce an inequality into the system. Everybody doesn't start from the same level playing field. Therefore, even the philosophy of capitalism visualizes substantial inheritance taxation. Death duties in Britain used to be so heavy. Even in the United States, which is really, a kind of archetypal capitalist economy, you have high inheritance taxes. So just these 2 taxes levied on the top 1% of the population would be enough to garner 7% of GDP as additional taxes, with which the government would be able to spend 10% in addition to what it is spending on all these heads. Of course, then you'll have to work out how much the center spends, how much the state spends, and so on. But in terms of simply mobilizing financial resources, there is no problem. Of course, mobilizing financial resources is not enough. There's no point actually simply giving money to people to buy food if there's no food in the market. So you'll have to have a corresponding change in the actual pattern of production, depending on the way that demand comes up, etc. But that, I take it, would happen when you actually have people demanding goods because of the money that they have got as part of the government's program for instituting economic rights. Economic rights, therefore, which are free of any kind of generosity, any kind of charity, but which actually give you the dignity of being a citizen of this country, should, I believe, be instituted. And when we do that, then of course we would be the envy of the world. Thank you. I better stop there. I've spoken a long time.
Thank you, sir, for the engaging discussion. Now it's time to address the question from our audience. We have received few queries. So the first query is by my fellow colleague, Nitish. I request Nitish to just unmute yourself and ask.
Okay. I just read the question, sir. So like you began on the note stating that our growth is led by services than manufacturing, and which is indeed true. Is there a way to answer this counterfactual, sir, that had it been manufacturing or primary sector led growth, we would have witnessed lesser inequality? Because I mean, as you have pointed this out, that technological progress is a necessity of capitalist order, and it would have anyways ensured, and it would have led to higher productivity, but again lower employment growth. So could it be said that that this fate was inevitable given the larger umbrella of neoliberal policy design, or do we have evidence of countries which have bypassed such fate?
No, I don't think the service sector, if instead of service sector, we had actually concentrated on the manufacture. Somehow, not for us to concentrate in a neoliberal economy, but if our growth had been focused on the manufacturing sector, would we have overcome the growth in inequality and poverty? I don't think so. I mean, in obviously the counterfactual, I can't really assert it, but my impression is no, because the fundamental reason why we have the rise in inequality and poverty, nutritional poverty, is because of the fact that our labor reserves don't get exhausted, because the rate of growth of employment is much less. The rate of growth of employment is much less because of the fact that you actually have high levels of labor productivity introduced because of competition under capitalism, to which our producers are now exposed, so that even though you may have higher GDP growth, you find that actually the rate of growth of employment is not very high. You see, even in countries like China, you take China, where actually the manufacturing sector has been the dominant sector for ushering in the growth. It has been the leading sector. In China, you actually find the elasticity of employment with respect to output in manufacturing is really, 0.07. Or something like that, so a 1% increase in manufacturing output gives rise to a 0.07% increase, which is virtually no increase in manufacturing employment. What is more, you also find that as sometimes when this argument is made, many people, I think Mr. Chidambaram used to do this quite often in Parliament and so on, that yes, employment is not growing. In that case, we should have still higher growth rate. And oddly enough, when you find that the growth rate accelerates, the actually elasticity of employment with respect to output declines. So that, it's not even as if a high rate of, somehow if you got a higher growth rate, you would be able to overcome the problem. No, actually the problem is not so easily overcome. So I don't think it's manufacturing versus services.
Yeah, so the next question is by my colleague Dipali. Dipali, you can unmute yourself.
Good afternoon, sir. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude for attending this lecture. So my question goes with like what we begin with. We begin with something like that. We are still somewhere, this distinction between the transfers and the payment for the services very much convoluted right now, right? Sir, I remember it's not kind of a question, but it's a opinion that I would like to know. I remember that back in 2017, during my master's days, I was conversating with my friends. We were just traveling somewhere, and there were some beggars on the red light, and we started discussion thereon, and it was precisely that. So we were, discussing over like whether we should be giving them the money or not, right? So can we just view that as money, which is going, let's say, from the X person whose salary is recorded with the government, right? Now it is going to some Y entity which is in between. The money is not getting reported. And now that entity, which is a beggar, is further spending it somewhere else. And again, it is going to get reported somewhere. So money is basically, which is transferred from person X to the beggar, is leakage. Can we just view it as that? And then that set of transactions is being somewhere gone or hidden or not recorded, and then we can just view that as that it got recorded again and be the part of the GDP later on. So
No, you see, what the beggar spends obviously would get recorded in GDP. The beggar may go and buy, let's say, whatever, a blanket, let us say. So the blanket would be recorded in the expenditure side and therefore correspondingly on the output side. But the point is, my giving the money to the beggar, which, if it is considered to be payment for a service, gives me satisfaction that I'm a generous man and so on. In that case, that would get recorded, but my giving the money to a beggar as a transfer would not get recorded. So it's at the first level that the difference arises, not at the subsequent levels. Okay.
And so there is one more thing. What we ended with, that basic income part. I completely agree with you on the fact that merely giving money to the people is not enough when you do not provide them with the means to spend it, and they would find it very expensive otherwise. But sir, I partially against that argument as well, because I feel that even if you provide them with certain kind of the institutions, the service and the quality of the service over there is not very much up to the mark. And second, the argument for that is not as such argument, but that's what I feel, that apart from education and healthcare, the structural changes also needs to be taken care of. And people may be coming up with the emerging demands for the different set of services. So for that, I feel that some amount of money, irrespective of the age, gender, and like other characteristics of the individual, is necessary, maybe.
Maybe, in other words, I'm simply talking about a rights-based approach versus a transfers-based approach. I'm really contrasting these two. Now, I believe that a transfer-based approach, which is what the basic income is something which it's conceptually very different, because at one level, the government appears as a generous charitable organization. They actually say, "Humne ye kiya, this is what we have given," and so on. On the other hand, the people receiving it appear like mendicants. Yes, this way. No, I mean, I believe in a democracy that should not be the case. I mean, I believe that every citizen must have some rights. Every citizen must have the dignity of enjoying rights. Okay, so I'm really looking at conceptually two different ways. On the details, what you say, yes, of course, education and healthcare is not enough. There may be other things, and these rights can be expanded. And, I have just taken these 5 rights to show what is possible. If they do not exhaust the set of rights I believe should be instituted. So, but I think the conceptual difference between a rights-based approach and a largesse, which is what the basic income transfers amount to, is that which I want to emphasize.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so the next question is by the student Akshita. She is asking, how is the share of surplus increases due to increase in labor productivity?
Oh, I see. You see, let's take a very simple example. If the output is 100, and suppose originally you required 50 laborers to produce this 100 output, labor productivity was 2, and each worker, let us say, got 1 rupee as the wage. Then the wage bill out of the 100 was 50, and the surplus was 50. Okay, labor productivity minus the wage multiplied by the total number of laborers gave you the total surplus. The share of surplus was half. Now suppose labor productivity doubles, in which case you actually produce the same 100 by using now only 25 workers. Okay. Now, there is no reason why wages would increase because of the fact that if the output remains 100, in that case, you get rid of 25 workers, they swell the labor reserves, and therefore the bargaining strength of workers goes down. And therefore, if you remember Arthur Lewis's argument about labor reserve, unlimited supplies of labor, they become even more unlimited. Wages remain the same. Wage bill is 25, surplus now is 75. In which case the surplus now becomes of total output 75%. It has increased from 50% to 75% through the rise in labor productivity.
Thank you, sir. So Nitish wants to ask. Nitish, you can.
Hi, sir. Thank you. So there's a follow-up question to what I asked before. So what would you say to the fear of capital flight if we come to implement the 5 economic rights? And won't it be effective if forums like G20 or other forums are utilized to achieve consensus on every nation state doing it, so that capital flight doesn't happen at an adversarial rate, or makes it instead ineffective? Instead of we becoming the envy of the world, we start envying others that our capital has flown to them, something like that.
Yes, that's a very important question. You see, basically, Keynes, who had suggested state intervention in demand management, had actually said that finance must be national. He wrote an article in the Yale Review in 1933, in which he said that finance must be national, because obviously finance is international and you have nation states. Then he saw the contradiction. During the Great Depression, Keynes had suggested that, look, why don't we have several countries coming together? Keynes was not the only one. A group of German trade unions also had suggested this, that a coordinated fiscal stimulus among many governments coming together. Now, that idea was turned down at that time, but what you are suggesting would in fact would probably amount to that: a coordinated fiscal stimulus undertaken by several countries coming together. Effectively, what is this coordinated? Basically, if you have globalized finance, you need a world state to control it. We don't have a world state. So the whole idea is to have a kind of coordination among nation states so that they can, as it were, mimic a world state. So the point is that, a coordinated fiscal stimulus, then finance can't go to the moon. So effectively, then you would have a kind of, government, a kind of, a de facto world state that controls globalized finance. But the problem is that this idea, which I think is a very good idea, has not even been mooted. I mean, have you come across this anywhere? I have not come across anywhere. You see, in the 1930s, at least it was mooted. Now it's not even mooted. Nobody even talking about this. I mean, even those thinking elements among, let us say, the established orthodox opinion, London economists and so on, who write about what should, they all say, yes, what we need now. London economist has had several editorials saying that, this is a Keynes-Roosevelt moment. That means that it is important for the state now to intervene the way it had done during the Keynes-Roosevelt era and so on. But the point is, it has never said anything about the possibility of financial flight, therefore the need to control finance either by what I'm suggesting is the nation state puts then boundaries around itself so that finance cannot flow out. The alternative is that actually several nation states form a surrogate world state. So either of these nobody is talking about. But so I don't see much chance of what you are saying happening, which is why I'm talking about the alternative, because we can't wait till all these countries have decided to come together.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for sharing your valuable insights. Due to time constraint, we are stopping the question answer session here. Now we would like to capture a moment of commemoration. This occasion, we invite all the graph. And before we conclude today's seminar, I would like to invite our esteemed head of the department, Dr. Jyotsna ma'am, to share a few closing remarks. Ma'am, if you would please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. It's my privilege that you give us time and enlighten our student. It's a very informative session. I think you remember I was a student in 2005-7 MA batch at CSP. Then further, I continue my MPhil and PhD under Professor Praveen Jha supervision. So please accept my heartfelt gratitude, and from my department side, from my side, and from institution sides. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for your patience in listening to me. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
So as we come to the end of this enlightening webinar, on behalf of Economics Association, I would like to express our heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Prabhat Patnaik, sir, for sharing his valuable insights with us today. Sir, your wisdom and expertise has enriched our understanding. I would like to express my sincere thanks to our esteemed speaker for taking the time out of their busy schedule to be here with us today. Your insights and guidance have undoubtedly added a new dimension to our understanding. We are truly grateful for your presence. I would also like to extend our gratitude to our respected principal, Professor Sadhna Sharma ma'am, for her unwavering support for encouragement in organizing this workshop. Without her guidance and approval, this event would not have been possible. Furthermore, I must acknowledge the effort of our head of the department, Dr. Jyotsna ma'am, for their continuous support and dedication to the academic growth of the student. I also extend our thanks to the audience for their active participation and thoughtful questions, making this webinar a truly engaging and informative experience. A special note of appreciation goes to the organizing team who made this event possible. Let's carry forward the knowledge gained from Dr. Patnaik's address and continue the dialogue on the crucial topics. Thank you all for your participation and contribution. Wish you a wonderful day ahead. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone, organizing team, our students, colleagues, friends, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Iti, Nitish, and all, Dipali.